There are times in history when two groups of aggressive people just couldn't be bothered to think that deeply. They really wanted to have a war and seized on the first available excuse to get rucking, no matter how lame or bizarre that excuse might be. Let's start with the history's most stupid wars ever. 10. Football War, El Salvador vs. Honduras, 1969. In June 1969, Honduras and El Salvador met in a two-leg 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier. There was fighting between fans at the first game in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa on 8 June 1969, which Honduras won 1-0. The second game, on 15 June 1969 in the Salvadoran capital of San Salvador, which was won 3-0 by El Salvador, was followed by even greater violence. On 27 June 1969, the day the playoff match took place in Mexico City, El Salvador dissolved all diplomatic ties with Honduras, stating that in the 10 days since the game in El Salvador 11,700 Salvadorans had been forced to flee Honduras. It said that as Honduras had done nothing to prevent murder, oppression, rape, plundering and the mass expulsion of Salvadorians, there was little point in maintaining relations. It further claimed that the government of Honduras has not taken any effective measures to punish these crimes which constitute genocide, nor has it given assurances of indemnification or reparations for the damages caused to Salvadorans. El Salvador won the decisive third game 3-2 after extra time. These matches happened to the tune of hooligans battering each other with nationalistic fury, causing tensions that could only be sated with a declaration of war. The evening of the third match, El Salvador dissolved diplomatic ties with its neighbor and invaded a couple of weeks later. The war lasted 4 days, hence the nickname, the 100 Hours War, and a ceasefire was negotiated without anyone really achieving anything. 9. A pig, Great Britain vs. USA, 1859. If nobody dies, is it still a war? This philosophical issue was raised in the aftermath of a conflict between Britain and the USA in 1859 when the two nations occupied bits of the North American continent. In what is now Canada and Washington state, they glared at each other across the border and claimed they were both allowed to live on the islands off the coast owing to a vaguely worded treaty saying who got to hang out where. In 1859, an American farmer on disputed San Juan Island was filled with patriotic rage when his neighbor's pig ate some of his potatoes. He shot the pig, which belonged to an Irish farmer, and when they were unable to decide how much the pig was worth, each man demanded the support of one of the colonial powers. The British governor of nearby Vancouver Island demanded Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines land Marines on the island and start shooting up those rude Yankees, but Baines refused on the grounds the whole thing was stupid. After a few days of soldiers milling around looking bemused, everyone pretty much gave up on the ridiculous farce of the pig war without a single shot being fired. 8. Bird droppings, Spain vs. Peru, 1864 to 1866. If you were to try to think up the most idiotic commodity to go to war over, actual fecal matter would probably be quite near the top of the list. That didn't stop Spain from starting a war against various South American nations over heaps of literal poo. The Spanish landed on the Chincha Islands in April 1864. The only notable feature of these islands, which were claimed by Peru, was that birds really loved defecating on them. The island's reserves of guano were valuable as a fertilizer, but the Spanish mainly wanted it to show they didn't think Peru was a proper country and they could take stuff from Peru's islands whenever they wanted. Peru disagreed, as did Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and boom, that's how you make a war. After a few naval battles both sides claimed to have won and the Spanish fleet sailed home claiming to have taught those greedy poop hoarders a lesson. 7. When someone got the hump over a camel. Some neighbors just don't get on. Take the tribes of Tagleb and Bakr, for example. They fought the Basus War for 40 years, over a camel. It began when the leader of the Tagleb tribe killed a camel which strayed onto its land. Unfortunately, the camel belonged to the wife of the other tribe leader. A small matter, you might think, but when pride and honor are at stake, things can get heated quickly. The Tagleb leader was killed in retaliation, and the two tribes were instantly at war. The Bakr leader, realizing that things had, perhaps got a little out of hand, sent his son to negotiate a truce. The Taglebs killed him. The Bakr leader swore vengeance and, neither side trusting the other, the fighting continued for 40 years. 6. The War of the Stray Dog, 1925. Sometimes it is difficult to identify a single inciting incident in a conflict, but in October 1925, there could be no doubt. The ensuing war was caused by a stray dog. At a border crossing, a playful dog, oblivious of nationality, managed to get off his leash, went for a run around. His owner, a Greek soldier, took a few steps into Bulgarian territory to catch his dog, whereupon a Bulgarian sentry shot him. Both sides immediately opened fire, before a Greek officer waving a white flag, crossed into no man's land to appeal for calm. The Bulgarians shot him too. The skirmish was the first test of strength for the new Greek military dictator, and he responded decisively. He gave Bulgaria 48 hours to apologize, arrest the snipers and compensate the families of the victims. Then, without waiting the 48 hours, he invaded Bulgaria anyway. The Greek army were not restrained. They looted and pillaged their way across Bulgaria, burning villages in their path. Bulgaria pushed back. Greece decided to call on its allies, and invited Serbia to join them in defending the honor of the dog. Bulgaria went to the League of Nations for protection. The war escalated quickly, and at least 50 people were killed as a result. The League of Nations judged Greece to be the aggressor and demanded that they pay compensation. 5. The right to sell drugs, Great Britain versus China, 1839 to 1842. Economics is a curious science, obscure and only partially understood by the majority of people, yet arguably the single biggest force influencing what we get up to every day. Economics, for instance, says that if you import things from a particular country, you need to sell that country just as much. In the mid-18th century, Britain just couldn't get enough of those groovy new Chinese silks and varieties of life-giving tea, but China didn't want anything the British Empire had. Britain needed to come up with an export product China really wanted. The East India Company came up with the ideal solution: drugs. Lots and lots of sweet, spirit-crushing drugs. They sold bucketloads of Moorish opium to China, got a load of Chinese people addicted to the stuff, and let the money roll in. China wasn't too keen on this and banned the opium trade in 1838, which struck Britain as being uncommonly rude, so they went to war. This whole drug-dealing dispute is now called the First Opium War, because the Brits tried to do it again 14 years later. 4. The War of Jenkins Ear, Great Britain versus Spain, 1739 to 1942. The War of Jenkins Ear is yet another strong case for Britain's stranglehold on the business of stupid wars. There was a British Navy captain named Robert Jenkins. Jenkins's ship was boarded by nefarious Spaniards in 1731, and they, for reasons best known to them, felt it an appropriate time to slice off the good captain's ear. Relations between Britain and Spain weren't exactly great at the time. The war had thus far been diverted through the actions of Sir Thomas Walpole, the British Prime Minister, who had settled upon a policy of consummate dullness. By 1739, Britain had become bored of sitting around and not shooting the Spanish, so, to provide a reason to go to war, a parliamentary hearing was called about Jenkins's de-earing 8 years earlier, and he got to parade his severed and probably rather shriveled ear around Parliament. Everyone there immediately declared this was a huge insult to the nation and war must begin forthwith. An estimated 500,000 people died in that war. That war then formed a major cause of the 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict in which approximately 1.25 million people died, and Britain eventually emerged as the dominant world power. 3. Nice chair, Great Britain versus the Ashanti Empire, 1900. If there's one thing European countries liked to do back in the day, it was chop Africa continent up into little pieces and sit on them pretending to be king. The British were doing this to a region called the Gold Coast, where Ghana is today. The people who already lived there were the Ashanti Empire, and Britain sent a person named Sir Frederick Mitchell Hodgson to get them on message in 1900. Unfortunately for the British, Hodgson was an idiot. He got to the town of Kumasi and told everyone the Queen of England was now in charge. He also noticed a really nice golden stool and angrily asked why he, as the Queen's representative, wasn't sitting on it. The stool was a spiritual object to the Ashanti, and was said to contain the spirit of their nation, ancestors and those yet to be born. The demand of Hodgson's buttocks angered the embodiment of their people was so offensive to the Ashanti that the War of the Golden Stool kicked off on the spot. The war ended, happily, with the Ashanti maintaining a veneer of independence. 2. Come on, everyone did it, Russia versus Finland, 1939–1940. In 1939, as the Second World War unfolded around the globe, Russia invaded Finland. The details of the conflict, with Russia feeding men into a frozen wilderness full of Finns who turned out to be really good shots, are well recorded. Soviets seems to have invaded Finland because that's the sort of thing everyone was doing. Germany and Russia had just divided Poland up between themselves, so Russia was all invasion happy and Finland was right there, just existing like a big frozen cake waiting to be devoured. The rest of the world was equally perplexed by the invasion, and kicked Russia out of the League of Nations. Fun bonus fact, the Russian politician Vyacheslav Molotov claimed the bombs of their air forces was dropping on Helsinki, were humanitarian aid packages. The Finns called the bombs Molotov's bread baskets. 1. Sorry but everyone was drunk. Austria vs. Ottoman Empire, 1788. Whether the Battle of Karánsebes actually happened in the way history remembers is a matter of debate. The story goes that in 1788, Austria and the Ottoman Turks were having a tiff that was in turn part of one of those big tedious wars that consumed Europe at the time. Austria had a massive army of up to 100,000 soldiers camping near the town of Karánsebes. That night a bunch of Austrians found some locals willing to sell them schnapps and soon got dangerously drunk. An argument inevitably followed between soldiers and some of them fired off a shot. It is because some of them shouted at the others by saying "Tursi, Tursi" to anger and scare them. But things gone wrong. Austrian army and locals started to flee and tried to go back the base. But in the base, commanders thought that enemy were coming and they ordered soldiers to fire cannons upon their friends. And later, Turks invaded Karánsebes easily. But however, Ottomans lost at the end of the war.